Welcome to the revision class on the core content of the 20th century part of the History IGCSE. Topic 1 asks us, were the peace treaties fair? It's mainly about Versailles. There are a few others. We're going to consider whether they were fair towards Germany and whether they were fair between the main peacemakers, between Britain, France and America. Here is Germany and here is the Austrian Empire to the south, and also Bulgaria. Those are the three countries that were defeated after World War I. Everybody expected those empires to be broken up to some extent, for them to pay some kind of financial compensation and possibly to have some military restrictions. That was generally expected if you were defeated in a war, and it was particularly expected if you were defeated in a war that the other side could claim you started. Focus point 1 asks us, what were the motives and aims of the big three at Versailles? And they were, of course, rather different. Here we have Clemenceau in the middle of this photograph. To his right, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, generally seen as the most moderate. To Clemenceau's left, we have David Lloyd George, the newly elected Liberal Prime Minister of Great Britain. And to the left of Lloyd George, the Italian Prime Minister, who we don't need to consider too much, because in the end the Italians were not as important in the final edit of the peace treaties. Let's start with the French. Of course, it is negotiated in the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. And remember that it was here that Germany had in fact signed and sealed a treaty with France in 1871. We've got this famous painting of the German emperor being proclaimed on the left at the top of those stairs, Bismarck in his magnificent white uniform in the middle. They just defeated the French in the so-called Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and in the Palace of Versailles, the Germans forced the French to cede the iron-rich province of Alsace-Lorraine, very strategically important, of course, between the two countries. Now, this was never forgotten by the French, certainly never forgotten by Clemenceau, a young man, of course, at that stage. And so the first priority of the French was to regain Alsace-Lorraine, which they believed had been criminally taken from them in 1871. And most of the other allies accepted that that would be carried out. I've put territorial security here. We're going to move on to the second objective that Clemenceau has. The Rhineland is this sliver of territory in Western Germany, which of course is a potential buffer zone between France and Germany. Ideally, Clemenceau wanted the Rhineland to become an independent state, but Wilson in particular was not impressed. He was not prepared to see Germany split up in that way, and that was to cause a fairly major disagreement between Clemenceau particularly and Wilson. In fact, Wilson even ordered his ship to get ready to take him back to America unless Clemenceau backed down on that. Part of territorial gains the French might make were, of course, colonial. In Africa, for instance, we've got this map here of French colonies just to the south of the German Cameroon, and there had been fighting there. French colonial troops had done well, they'd occupied German Cameroon. So Clemenceau, less important to him than the British, but Clemenceau also had his eyes on some German colonies as well. So here he is, Le Tigre, of course, the tiger for his temperament. He was known to be fiery. And this famous painting here of school children in France being taught about the German theft of Alsace-Lorraine. This schoolboy here has his history teacher pointing at the lost province. Clemenceau will use this kind of sense of grievance that Germany has attacked France not once but twice. It can't be trusted. And also, of course, looking at this photo, it feeds onto this second priority, which is the Germans attacked France in August 1914. It wasn't the other way around. And this photograph, in fact, of the village of Passchendaele, which is Belgium, it's not France, but it's the best photo we have of aerial view of just how destructive warfare was, how it could literally destroy every standing building. And so consequently, Clemenceau was very clear that that had to be paid for in blood. France, of course, lost almost 1.4 million men. You can see here its casualty rate at 25% of soldiers aged between 18 to 30 was very, very high. So relating to the damage that the Germans had done, financial and to human life, came the third French priority, which was to reduce German military power. Now, Clemenceau actually favoured complete demilitarisation of Germany. If he had had his way, he would have had the entire German army abolished. So he was the more extreme of the three on reducing Germany's military power to prevent a repetition of 1871 and 1914. So what of David Lloyd George and the British perspective? It's a slightly different perspective. The British, of course, fought with enormous determination as well. Their war was, in a sense, slightly shorter because they had not really been all-out fighting on the Western Front until 1916. So the war experience was possibly less intense than it had been for the French. But of course, it had been a war to end all wars as well, in terms of how the British saw it. And Lloyd George was under pressure to make the Germans pay. That was a famous headline of one of the newspapers in the election of December 1918. And so financial compensation was right at the top of the list of Lloyd George's priorities. That needs to be tempered, though, by this attitude that he has in this private letter. He says the French are very panicky about Germany, which you can understand, but they would like to cripple Germany forever. Now, Lloyd George, of course, is saying in that letter that the French want to cripple Germany, but it's not in our interests to cripple the German economy. Well, why not? You can see from these graphs that they were very important trading partners before World War I. Indeed, Great Britain imported more from Germany than any other country in 1913. Lloyd George thought it was in the interests of both Great Britain and Germany that the export-import relationship should be restored. That said, you can see from this slide that Britain spent much more money than any other country fighting World War I. And Lloyd George had promised, or rather Eric Geddes, one of his ministers, had promised this. He said, the Germans, if this government is returned, are going to pay every penny. They're going to be squeezed as a lemon is squeezed until the pips squeak. With this enormous debt that the British government had incurred, it was natural that he would want to go back to Britain at the end of the treaty and say to the British public, look, we've made them pay. His second priority was the seizure and reduction of the German Navy. Why was that? Well, of course, there had been a vast U-boat or submarine campaign, and the Germans had sunk more British ships successfully in that campaign than any other nation. And so the German Navy, at surrender, had to sail its entire fleet up to Scotland, to Scapa Flow, and the expectation for Lloyd George was that that fleet would be acquired by the Royal Navy, by the British. The third priority for Lloyd George was to retain the colonies that the British Empire had won in World War I. This map shows in blue the German possessions in Africa. By the time everyone met at Versailles, those German forces had surrendered, and Lloyd George had his eyes on those colonies to be part of the British Empire. All in all, therefore, Britain has lots of self-interest at stake here, although they tend to be more moderate. This quote, "We do not want a treaty so harsh that we will have to fight another war in 25 years' time," is a quote worth trying to remember, because it indicates Lloyd George's kind of pragmatic attitude. He knows that if this treaty between France and Germany is too harsh and brings about another reckoning between the two, then Britain would almost certainly have to get involved again, which Britain didn't want to do. This leads us on to the Americans, Wilson and his first priority. Now, the Americans take a rather more principled position on the treaty. Wilson uses this phrase, self-determination for nations. And what he means is this, that Germans should rule Germans, that Hungarians should rule Hungarians, that Czechs should rule Czechs. From an American point of view, the First World War was ultimately a war between empires. And of course that is true. All of the major nations of Europe that fought with one another had large empires. And the Americans take this view that these empires should effectively be dissolved. He didn't say that in so many words to the British and the French, but Lloyd George and Clemenceau knew what the Americans were driving at when Wilson said that these empires were essentially war-making powers, and that it was the duty of the peacemakers to reduce the capability of empires to rule over peoples, that peoples should govern themselves. Wilson's second priority is to set up a League of Nations. There's the assembly on the left, and there's the building where it was established in Geneva in Switzerland. Wilson takes this view that if there will be small countries that are self-governing, that are self-determined, let's say a new Poland or a new Czechoslovakia, that these countries will be more secure if they are members of an international organisation. And particularly if this international organisation is set up on the basis of collective security, on the basis of defending the smaller members. In particular, if the League of Nations is committed to the principles of free trade and disarmament, and of course to improving the health and labour conditions of its members. So it's a very principled, idealistic kind of view. And if we look at the 14 points, which are well worth trying to remember, the 14th one, it's the last one, that Wilson probably cared about more than any other at all. A League of Nations to guarantee independence and territorial integrity to great and small. And the first four principles there are worth looking at because they underpin what he hopes will be a kind of a new international order that will abolish war once and for all. So focus point 2, why did all the victors not get everything they wanted? That's to say, why was there dissatisfaction? This map indicates in black Germany's territorial losses. To the west, Alsace-Lorraine was ceded to France. That was uncontroversial. There didn't need to be any debate about that. Just to the north of Alsace-Lorraine is a very important coal region called the Saarland. And the Saarland was effectively French. That's to say, still part of Germany, but administered by the League of Nations so that the coal fields of the Saarland could serve France's economic needs. This was so that the French knew that they would be paid reparations in the form of coal deliveries. France has never been rich in coal. Well, after 15 years, that was going to be put up to a plebiscite, but for the moment, the Saarland is administered by Wilson's League of Nations. Northern Schleswig is a territory that Germany had won in a war against Denmark a long time before, in 1864-5 actually. But Northern Schleswig had German speakers in it, it also had Danish speakers in it, and after a plebiscite, the northern Danish part of that small country was awarded to Denmark. I think the most important territorial loss, that the Germans in a sense could accept many territorial losses, but it's in the east that German nationalists later on were really angered by. And this is because the so-called Polish corridor, its real name is Prussia, the western part of Prussia, so it's better to call it West Prussia, this very large territory that contained millions of German speakers, was awarded to a new country, of course, Poland. Now, the French, the Americans, the British cared very much about creating a new independent Poland. The Poles had been under the German Empire and under the Russian and the Austrian empires for well over 100 years. And this was an important principle to restore Poland. But by restoring Poland, the Allies were also keen to give Poland a port. And that meant awarding the western part of Prussia to Poland and giving the Poles access to this port. In the north here you can see Danzig, which was to be a port run by the League of Nations. It was mainly a German-speaking city. They weren't going to give it to Poland, but it would be administered by the League of Nations. And you can see by looking at this map what that means for Germany as a country. It is severed into two, because the green in the east, the eastern part of Prussia, was now cut off from Germany proper. And as we're revising, of course, we need to look forward and think, well, of course, it will be there. It will be around that part of Europe that World War II eventually would break out. It was by attacking West Prussia on the 1st of September 1939 that Hitler started a second war. So Germany has lost about 14% of its territory and 13% of its population, which were all very significant. And then going beyond Europe to its colonial losses, you can see in Africa, the German colonies there, the Southwest Africa went to South Africa, Cameroon went to France, and Tanganyika in the east there went to Britain, and then Papua New Guinea, the blue just above Australia, went to Australia. And now we turn to Germany's military losses. The army was not abolished. Lloyd George and Wilson insisted that Germany must have some ability to defend itself for the sake of stability. But the army was very small, 100,000 only, and they couldn't be conscripted. They had to be volunteers, it had to be a professional army, and that prevented Germany from recruiting waves of 20-year-olds every year and creating a large reserve in its population of trained soldiers. It could only levy a professional army of 100,000 men. Secondly, German forces were only allowed what we might call defensive weapons. That's to say that tanks, mobile artillery, poison gas, of course, an air force, all of these arms that could be used to attack France or attack Eastern European countries, these were made illegal under the Treaty of Versailles. This photo shows German demobilised soldiers literally smashing up the new tanks that they'd built just a couple of years before. A third point is that the Rhineland that we mentioned earlier, that sliver of territory between France and Germany that Clemenceau ideally would have split from Germany, it remained inside Germany, but it was to be demilitarized. And that's to say that the Germans would not be allowed to put any forces in there. They could have some policemen, but they couldn't have any soldiers or any defensive fortifications. Most of that satisfied Clemenceau. Lloyd George is disappointed that he can't get hold of all of Germany's fleet. This isn't to do with the treaty, but the German sailors actually managed to sink their fleet once they got it to Britain, so Britain didn't get its hands on the German shipping. But that's not in the treaty. The key bits of the treaty are this, that the German naval reductions are to only 6 battleships, to only 6 battle cruisers, to only 15,000 sailors, and of course no submarines. And that really was a very, very small navy compared to the size of the pre-war German fleets. What are the reparations? Now, the bill was finally settled, not at Versailles, but just a year later, by a commission that calculated the financial reparations. They came up with a figure of £6.6 billion. And this is normally said to be a very large amount of money. Now, Germany didn't really have gold, or it wasn't producing much wealth at that stage to trade for money. So the reparations were to be paid in kind, which means were to be paid in coal and timber and basically in goods that were in short supply in Europe after World War I. So now we're in a position to answer the question of focus point 2, why did all the victors not get everything they wanted? We can see that the French got quite a lot of the things that they wanted, but they didn't get complete German military restrictions. We can see the British Empire did get naval limitations, it did get some financial reparations. And we can see that the Americans did get their League of Nations, and they did get some self-determination for nations. So in a sense, the Allies were reasonably pleased with what they attained. It's a relatively good compromise. The French were probably the most dissatisfied, and that was because, as we've seen, in terms of territorial losses, Germany remained a single, powerful, unitary state. The Germans also retained armed forces. And so, from Clemenceau's point of view, it wasn't quite as punishing as he and his military would have liked. So focus point 3 asks us what the impact was on Germany up to 1923. The Kaiser got away with it in the sense that he wasn't put on trial, he was allowed to flee to Holland, he died there in retirement. Germany had a revolution, and the revolution created the Weimar Republic that was essentially very unstable. There was unrest and there were revolts from both the left, from the Social Democrats. Here are the Spartacists who were in revolt in Berlin in January 1919, and also from the right, revolts by Wolfgang Kapp, for example, in 1920. That was stimulated by the refusal of a German brigade, the Marian Brigade, to dissolve itself. It was having to comply with the abolition of many units in the German army that were mandated by the Treaty of Versailles. So we have a lot of political unrest, a lot of political instability in Germany now that the Kaiser has gone and the new government was being forced into signing a treaty that would be so unpopular at home. The Germans found repayment of reparations extremely difficult. And in 1923, in January 1923, they defaulted. That's to say, they were due to pay a large consignment of coal and timber, and they refused. And so the French and Belgian forces invaded the Ruhr in 1923 to go and get it themselves. That's to say that French forces were literally standing in occupation of large industrial areas in the west of the country. The response of the German Chancellor was to order the workers to stay at home. It's, if you like, a kind of government-ordered strike. And that led to the complete collapse of German production. Prices soared, hyperinflation was reaching billions of percent, and that photograph, famous photograph of children playing with banknotes as if they're kind of building blocks because they're so useless, was the consequence. So we have political instability, we have financial and economic meltdown, and lastly, Article 231. This is the part of the treaty that was commented on greatly in the German newspapers. Of the 440 articles of the Treaty of Versailles, it's perhaps the war guilt clause that was the hardest to accept. This says that the Allied governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of her and her allies for causing all the loss and damage. Well, why was that so resented? It was resented because not only did it mean that the Germans had started a war that ended up losing, and that was very, very hard to take, but it also was the legal justification for the financial reparations. That's to say, they had to pay for the war because they'd started the war. And many German members of the public did not accept that they had started the war. Their press had said that they were under threat from France and Russia, and that they had had to mobilize in order to defend themselves against that threat. So it's a kind of moral loss on top of the political and financial losses of post-war Germany. These men were the men who were really responsible for fighting the war and, of course, for running the war effort. Here we have the Kaiser in the middle, we have Hindenburg on the left, Ludendorff on the right, his all-powerful generals. These men escaped all punishment, and therefore a common criticism of the Treaty of Versailles is that it's the German people that have to pay the price for defeat in World War I. And in fact, the decision makers, the Kaiser and his generals, they get away without any punishment at all. Of course, not a mistake that's made after World War II. It's worth considering the other treaties with Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Let's deal with Austria-Hungary, or Austria and Hungary first. Austria-Hungary, of course, had been a single empire that looked like this in yellow, and then was divided into a small state of Austria, which signed the Treaty of Saint-Germain, and the smaller state of Hungary that signed the Treaty of Trianon. Saint-Germain said that Austria should lose 3/4 of its possessions. Austria had to pay war reparations to Italy, in fact, who be mainly fighting, and her army was reduced to 30,000. The Treaty of Trianon is similar, but with slightly different numbers. Hungary lost 2/3 of her possessions, also had to pay reparations. Her army was reduced to a slightly larger 40,000. I wonder if that was because the Soviet Union was to the east. So consequently, if we look at this map, we have Austria-Hungary breaking up into the constituent nations. Now, of course, this is Woodrow Wilson. If you look back to his 14 points, you'll see that Austria-Hungary and its dissolution is listed in there. It's number 10, I think, of his 14 points. And this is done very successfully. When we come to revise topic 3, we will, of course, be considering whether breaking the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the best thing for stability in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Unfortunately, very many of these new countries become quite easy prey for Hitler's Third Reich. But when we consider this map and the extent to which Austria-Hungary was made up of so many different nationalities, and then we compare that to this map that shows that now the Czechs and the Slovaks rule themselves as a single country. The Hungarians now rule themselves. They don't have to share sovereignty with the Austrians. We have Romania. Romanians in the southeast are now connected up with the old state of Romania there. And we have this interesting new federation, the Yugoslav state in the south, which was a way of kind of putting together a number of smaller Slav peoples into what they hoped would be one strong and viable state, the Yugoslav state. Of course, at the heart of it would be the Serbs. And if you like, you can think of it this way. The Serbs were kind of being rewarded, weren't they, for fighting in World War I on the Allied side, for never giving in. They never gave in, despite being up against Austria-Hungary. And so Serbia is kind of rewarded by being at the heart of this new Yugoslavia. The rather odd one is the Treaty of Neuilly, because of course Bulgaria joined Austria-Hungary in World War I, and the Treaty of Neuilly there, you can see, punishes Bulgaria for being on the wrong side. The Bulgarians lost 1/12 of their territory, Yugoslavia got some of it, Greece, always pro-Allied as we'll see throughout the 20th century, Greece of course rewarded too, Bulgaria paid reparations. The Bulgarian army was reduced to 20,000. So the final focus point is really just a question of consideration. Could the treaties be justified at the time? It's not really very historical if we just say the Treaty of Versailles treated Germany badly. That's not really what the question's asking you. It's asking you to think about whether the people of the time thought it was fair and even-handed, given that Germany had lost a war, given that Germany was thought to have started that war. Now, Marshal Foch said that this is not a peace treaty, it's a ceasefire for 20 years. And he was saying that from the point of view of, well, it's not really punishing the Germans nearly enough. It means that they can just get back on their feet and come back at us again. So Foch was of the view that it was too lenient. Another view and another way of thinking about whether it was fair was to consider it from this perspective. What would the Germans have done if they had won the war? That was something, of course, that was in the back of the minds, particularly of Clemenceau and Lloyd George. And they pointed to this treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is with the Russians. The Germans had basically defeated the Russian army in 1917. Russia had had a revolution, of course, And with this man in power, Lenin, at the head of the Soviet state, was desperate to deliver peace to the Russian people. And the price that Soviet Russia was asked to pay was huge. You can see here the vast territorial losses that Russia had to pay Germany, 6 billion German marks. It was to lose vast amounts of its agriculture and its industry. And this was an argument that was used at Versailles. It was to say, well, look, if the Germans had defeated us, they would have done this. Is that a good argument? Up to you to decide. We do know now that the Germans did have the ambition of annexing Belgium, for example. We do know that they were intent on forcing France into trade deals that would be very, very beneficial to Germany. We do know that they had territorial ambitions in Central Europe. So it is a reasonable way of analysing the fairness of the Treaty of Versailles. This cartoon is clearly, from a British point of view, where it's saying to this German politician, you've got to swallow it whether you like it or not. Swallowing a bitter pill. And the view of this British newspaper is that the Germans are going to have to take this bitter medicine. The German view was, of course, very different. This cartoon is also widely known of a sort of demonic figure, maybe a kind of a vampire, which is literally draining Germany of its life blood. This cartoon shows the German army reduced to its 100,000, being surrounded by the French on the left with 660,000 forces, it says, the Poles to the east with their 300,000, the Czechs to the south, and of course all of these figures are holding the chains to deny Germany its freedom. This cartoon has the view that the peace treaty has created new states in the east of Europe that would be allies to the French, that would be collaborators in encircling and restraining Germany in the future. So we are now in a position to evaluate focus point 4. Could the treaties be justified at the time? On the left, we've got the kind of arguments that you could pursue to say no, to say it was too harsh. Firstly, the wrong Germans were punished. You could go on to say that in many ways, the losses of territory, the numbers of Germans who were now under foreign rule, the numbers of Germans who, for example, lost their economic livelihoods, that they were being punished when in fact Germany was taken into war by their emperor, that the Germans had been forced to fight an aggressive war by the decision of Wilhelm to support the Austrians in their war against Serbia. The second idea is that in fact the Germans themselves didn't achieve self-determination. We've seen how many Germans now were under foreign rule. It was probably about 5 or 6 million Germans were now part of Poland or Denmark, or they were ruled by the Czechs, or they were part in Alsace-Lorraine. If they lived in Alsace-Lorraine, they'd now be ruled by the French. So you could argue that Woodrow Wilson had given self-determination to, let's say, the Czechs, but he'd not managed to achieve that for Germans, and that was therefore too harsh on them. You could say that it is clear that Germany has no military protection against attack. Germany has more neighbours than any other state in Europe. It's in the middle of Europe, and Germany's security relies upon being able to match the forces of its neighbours. And the military restrictions are so harsh that they can't do that. A fourth line of argument can focus on this German word Diktat, that's to say dictation. The Germans would have expected to be at the conference and negotiate the terms of the conference. And of course, once there was a revolution, there was no Kaiser, a new government, the Allies soon decided that there was no way that the Germans would be at the conference of Versailles. So there's this feeling amongst the German public that it was something that had been imposed upon them without any real consent. They were given some weeks to comment on the terms of the treaty in the spring of 1919, but essentially all they could do was object and petition, and very little was changed when they did that. The last objection, and this might be the most powerful one, is the objection to the financial reparations, that these reparations were too high, they were unrealistic, they were damaging to the German economy, and they were so damaging that it produced unrest inside Germany, real dissatisfaction inside Germany, the hyperinflation, of course, and in turn, communism and Nazism grew. The extremist parties flourished because of the terrible economic conditions produced by the treaty. And that's a very powerful argument, that Germany was a new democracy, and that new democracy needed a relatively fair financial situation, and the reparations bill made that impossible. Now, on the other side, you could argue that in many ways you agree with Foch that the treaty wasn't harsh enough. Well, for a start, you could argue it wasn't as harsh as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That's to say, it was entirely reasonable to make these territorial and financial claims on Germany, because that is what victor nations do. That's what they did in the 19th century. That's what Germany did in 1871. It took territory from France, it took reparations from France, and then the Germans themselves claimed those off Soviet Russia. So this is the argument of kind of just desserts, you could say. You could point to the fact that Germany did remain a single unitary state. Germany wasn't broken up into smaller states. It was separated between the East and the West by the Polish corridor, we talked about that, but it remained a single state. You can say that there was no attempt to put the Kaiser or anyone on trial as such, and that meant that there was no kind of reckoning, there was no kind of punishments of any of the German leaders, and that wasn't harsh enough. And you could argue, of course, that the armed forces terms were not particularly punishing, and in fact that they were unenforceable. It's often said about the Treaty of Versailles that there's nothing in there about consequences. What are the Allies going to do if the Germans didn't comply? Well, we'll see in the 1930s what happens when they don't comply, and the answer, of course, is not very much. But you could take the view that here was an opportunity for the Allies to completely disarm Germany and leave it without any forces at all. I'm not convinced it's a particularly strong one, but you could try to argue that. So you'll see that this question is very open-ended. It is entirely a question of discussion and judgment, and so good luck with it.